.66 degrees outside at 16 minutes past the 8 o'clock hour on Friday, September the 15th. Chris Lenoir with you for one more hour on the Green Mountain Mornings program. Olga Peters still riding shotgun here on the program.
No new coffee cups yet either. So
you're still on that
I'm
second
still on
cup
that
of
one,
coffee.
yeah.
I think I've lapped you at least twice on the coffee then so far. Also, no stranger to coffee is Mike Fair, who is here in the studio with us this morning. Good to see you, Mike.
Good to see you. I brought an entire mug.
He brought his own. He brings his own BYOC for Mike there. Although I think I've seen you take a little bit of what's in the pot out there in the green room.
I might have.
You might have indeed. Good for you to do that because you're a busy man. You write for VT Digger, and then your stories also appear in the Commons as well as the Brattleboro Reformer. So a lot of different places you'll see Mike's byline. We also appreciate him being in here whenever we get together for conversations with the media, and we appreciate Brattleboro Savings and Loan for their financial support of having Brattleboro Community Television in here to document these conversations. Brattleboro Savings and Loan is an ultra-local programming sponsor of BCTV programming. Mike, let's just get the obligatory VY update out of the way now. That's what we always call it because, you write about several different things, but certainly VY and the sale of the decommissioned plant in Vernon from Entergy to North Star and going through this process deserves a lot of attention, a lot of different updates. A couple of stories in this week's edition of the Commons that are right on the front page about this. One having to do with this reduction in the size of the security area. This is really no surprise for anybody who's been paying attention. I remember you and I talking about this when this was proposed to, I think even back then it was Public Service Board. Now it's the Public Utilities Commission here in the state. I like to call them VPUC. I'm hoping that catches on. I'm trying real hard to get that to catch on.
I'm going to use that now.
Mm-hmm.
Please do. But this actually goes back to not even last Thursday. The Thursday before last, August 31st, is when this ruling came down, right?
Yeah, the state, as you say, this wasn't unexpected. The state told Entergy that they can decrease the size of their protected area from a little over 10 acres to just about 1 acre. And this has to do with the fact that they're moving all the fuel onto the spent fuel pad. And so there's a much smaller area. By the end of next year, there'll be a much smaller area that they need to protect.
And depending on who you are and how you feel about this whole process, one could actually argue this isn't necessarily bad news when you're talking about lowering the security footprint for a couple different reasons, most notably, especially for North Star and Entergy, the cost.
Yeah, they're going to save over $1 million a month, and that's mainly just the cost of security. It's something that's been planned for. I would say they'd be doing this even if they weren't trying to sell the plant.
Sure,
but they're doing it a lot quicker, several years quicker,
right?
Than they would have if they weren't trying to unload it to North Star.
Also, easier to secure a smaller footprint of space than it would be a bigger footprint of space, but. The cost issue is something that people have been concerned about with North Star as a buyer. You and I have had conversations about the different people who have, asked for intervener status in this process. They're saying, can we really trust that North Star can afford to do this or that there's enough money in the decommissioning fund? Right. New England Coalition being one of those groups. And even though this ruling went against them, they're pretty concerned about this whole idea of this smaller footprint. What are some of their reasons?
Well, I think they were more concerned about the process. It gets a little bit into the weeds, but in a nutshell, Entergy got approval to build a second spent fuel pad at the site last year from the state. And so when they wanted to downsize their security, they asked the state for permission to do that as an amendment to that decision that was made last year, thereby sort of trying to bypass a lot of the red tape that would come with the state process. And New England Coalition objected to that. They said, look, this is actually a pretty major project they're proposing, and we don't think that it should simply be an amendment. There should be a hearing. There should be a real review process. And ultimately, the state said, no, we don't think so, and and they granted permission for it.
And in your story, it didn't seem to me that the folks at New England Coalition were necessarily disagreeing with the idea that this is a safer move as far as securing the material in a smaller footprint. And it seems like they didn't necessarily disagree with the fact that it's going to cost less, which is something that people are concerned about as far as the cost. They're just concerned about how the decision was made.
How the decision was made, and also I think, in terms of the new structures that Entergy is proposing there, is that will they stand out a little more if North Star is able to do what they say they can do, which is clean up the site a lot quicker? So there were some aesthetic concerns in there, but I do think, as you say, it goes back to the process. No one, I think, disputes the notion that it's better to have all of this radioactive stuff out of this pool in the reactor building and into these giant casks. The question has always been, where do you put it? How do you get it there? That sort of thing.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to discount any of those concerns. This is still less than ideal, and not the deal that we struck with the federal government back when Vernon, and I'm still saying we, because even though I haven't lived in Vernon for years, I still feel an affinity for that hometown. But it is really the concerns going forward then for the site, which actually leads us to the other story on the front page of the Commons that you wrote, and this has to do with my neighbor, Rich Holshoe, and the Abenaki tribe, and they have intervener status. And interesting, in this case, what you're writing about, it sounds to me like North Star reached out to Rich as far as really wanting to talk to them specifically about some of their thoughts and feelings about what happens to this site after all the cleanup goes on.
Yeah, I mean, that and that reaching out occurred, to the tribe's credit, after they filed some pretty detailed testimony with the state that said, basically, we don't think that Native American interests have ever been adequately represented at this site. One thing that really shocked me was that the tribe pointed out an NRC document from 2007 that said that when this plant was built, there was never a formal archaeological survey done at that time. And I couldn't believe that. And so the tribe's argument is we just don't know what's at that site. It's an ancestral homeland. And if North Star is going to be turning a lot of dirt, essentially, we'd like to have some say in how that happens.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a credit to Rich. He's really done a great job of bringing, I would say, revitalizing attention to Native American tribes in this area, not just the Abenaki, the Sokoke, and I've learned a little bit of that by following his blog and having him here on the show. And I'll give North Star props too for wanting to pay attention to this. You think about what's happening with the Dakota Access Pipeline and that thing. I'm sure Scott State of North Star saying that this is something that they want to avoid that kind of PR.
Well, and didn't he say too that in other projects they've worked with local communities?
Yeah, I mean, they dig a lot. That's what they do. So they're familiar with archaeological and cultural concerns. The interesting thing is, he used the word, Scott State, the CEO of North Star, used the word balance. And I don't necessarily think that he wants someone there sort of sifting through every shovelful of dirt because that might throw the project off a little bit. So they're going to have to try to figure out how can they compromise and come up with a solution that accommodates the tribe.
Which is going to be interesting since there's no baseline on this property, since no archaeology was ever conducted.
Well, and with the what happens after this site once it's cleaned up and reused, and granted we're talking about decades, I mean there's a possible opportunity here that could be met by all the different parties involved. I know this is the very beginning of the conversation, but depending on what they find, this could be something that's really good for the Abenaki tribe, for the town of Vernon, and for the decommissioning folks. But that's a ways down the road. Appreciate you making people aware that conversation has started in such a cordial way. Mike Fair has written about other non-Vermont Yankee topics, and we'll cover some of those with him when we come back after the bottom of the hour news break. 66 degrees outside at 20 minutes before the 9 o'clock hour. You just heard that liner Randy Holhut doing for these segments on Green Mountain Mornings. Randy Holhut, about the only member of the Commons newsroom not in the studio right now. Since we have Mike Fair here, who also writes for VT Digger, and their former Olga Peters here as well, trying the show on for size. And great to have you both in here. And Wendy comes in now. Maybe we should just call Wendy and had her join us as well. That would have been a thing.
She's right around the corner.
She's not too far away. She may be listening right now. But we're focusing on Mike's stories that he's been writing for. And this one, this one is in the Commons, I believe. Two of these stories that we're going to cover, one happened after the deadline. I'm sure it'll be in next week's. But this one about the solar developer from Connecticut, Freepoint Solar, was on the inside of the front section of this week's edition of the Commons and online at commonsnews.org. This is a Connecticut-based and sounds like a pretty big solar developer, Mike.
Yeah, that's what they claim. They're not returning my calls, so it's hard to. I couldn't ask them.
The hype looks good, though.
Yeah. You know, I think there's been so many of these solar projects proposed and built now that we just don't write about every single one of them anymore. They're not a new thing, but these are so big, 20 megawatts. And I always kind of, for perspective, go back to that big array at Exit 3
right.
in Brattleboro. Was built as a 2 megawatt. So this is 10 times that size.
And that was the biggest one in Vermont at the time, right?
I think so,
or
yeah.
close to it. So, you're talking about that. And one of them happening potentially in our community when we're talking about down in Vernon again, speaking of power down in Vernon. So this is basically all just kind of in the planning stages, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about this story is it came about because I was looking through the ISO New England database. So ISO runs the regional power grid, and if you want to plug a big power generator into the grid, you have to ask them for permission. And they list these projects that have asked them for permission. And I noticed these, as you say, one in Vernon, there's one in Shaftesbury, and one in Fairhaven in Rutland County, all 20 megawatt solar projects, and we'd not heard anything about these. But ISO won't tell you which developer is proposing those, so I was kind of stuck. And as it turned out, somebody at the State Department of Public Service, said you ought to look at this proposal in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts wants to buy large amounts of renewable energy, and they've put out this RFP. Developers, tell us where we can buy all this renewable energy. And so this company, Freepoint Solar, said, well, we know we can build 3 20-megawatt solar arrays plus other projects in Vermont, and we'll sell the power to you in Massachusetts. Now, Massachusetts hasn't accepted that bid, but that's how these projects are proposed. So as it turned out, all of the details about these projects came from documents that were filed in Massachusetts.
And most of them sealed. Most of them you can't get access to.
Most of them redacted, which is what's so frustrating. Like, so we know the project's proposed in Vernon, we don't know where because all that's blacked out.
Right.
Well, and it didn't seem like if you were to ask the folks in Vernon, hey, do you know that they're planning to put this 20 megawatt solar array? You ask, Josh Unruh or any other members of the select board, they'll be, what are you talking about?
Well, and that's the other interesting aspect of this. I don't want to cast any aspersions on this company,
that's my job.
Solar, but they represent in each of these applications that they've initiated discussions with these towns. And in fact, for the town of Shaftesbury in Bennington County, they go so far as to talk about those discussions. But when I called Vernon, Shaftesbury, Fairhaven, it was crickets. They all said, we don't know who this company is. We haven't talked to them. And so I don't know what's going on.
This is the exact opposite of what we're seeing from successful solar projects, where you go to the select board. We're seeing some local solar companies going to these boards.
And you're getting support at every single level of the process.
Yeah,
and when you're talking about some of the and we all know this being in Vermont and covering Vermont, some of the controversies around renewable energy siting, granted more about wind, but it seems like more and more pushback on solar. These town plans are getting more deference as far as master plans, where they're sited, things like that. It just shows when you're coming from another community in Connecticut, Freepoint Solar, and you don't know the lay of the land, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure right off the bat, it seems.
And I think the other thing about these projects that may, if they progress beyond this stage, that may cause some controversy is the fact that all the power would be going right out of state, all the renewable energy credits right out of state. So ostensibly, it doesn't do anything to further Vermont's renewable energy goals, yet we are hosting these giant arrays.
Well, and that's what caught my attention is, once again, one of the arguments around something like Vermont Yankee was the host community might get all the spent fuel, but most of the power went out of state. And it's that same thing of you cite the power in a rural community, and the city, the metropolis, there we go, gets the benefit.
Yeah. Cue the Peter Galbraith sound bites right now, right? Because this is exactly what he campaigned on when he was talking about how all these wind turbine arrays were really not beneficial when you're talking about all the energy going out. Sounds like a very similar plan here. Although ISO New England, I mean, they basically they kind of manage the exchange of power between the different states in New England, right, Mike?
That's right. I mean, the electrons, whatever they are, I'm not an engineer, but everything goes into the grid and flies around, and it's hard to say where power goes. But in terms of the renewable energy credits, that's a big part of this, and they would all go to Massachusetts. The same thing has happened. There's been one similarly sized array, 20 megawatts, that's been approved for Ludlow, and all that is going to Connecticut. So what you have is Green Mountain Power and some other Vermont utilities saying, look, we don't want projects this big. We can't tie into them. We have no need. And so if they're going to be built, the power is going to go out of state.
Yeah. I mean, I've had conversations with Art Miller down in Vernon about solar, somebody who has land that he could possibly give to a company like this. And he's somebody who's really not on board with that idea. He was much more on board with the gas plant refinery, oddly enough, than the solar array.
That's right.
I think they're going to find when they go to Vernon with this idea a very different response than other parts of Vermont. And I know you covering Vernon, you might agree with that, Mike.
Yeah, and I can't help but think they've really gotten themselves off on the wrong foot by representing to the state, to Massachusetts, that they've talked to these local communities when they haven't.
Yeah, even a sympathetic community, they might have already rubbed the wrong way with the way that they're approaching this. Something definitely to keep an eye on. When Mike Fair isn't writing about energy, he uses bridge construction as a diversion. And you went out to the ribbon cutting ceremony dedication. Where was there a ribbon out there? Did they
There
do
was.
a ribbon?
They cut a ribbon.
They cut a ribbon and everything. So the I-91 bridge has been open for several weeks now, maybe even a couple of months at this point. I mean, I know they still have done some lane closures from time to time as they're doing cleanup or something like that. And it's a bridge that, as you do a great job of pointing out how it was delayed in building. Was the ceremony delayed for some similar reason too? Or was that just kind of staying in the spirit of this whole project?
Well, I think, probably it was just a chance to get the governor out there and do the whole, the formal grand opening. It was, and I initially was pretty skeptical going into it, thinking, well, what's the news? We know the bridge is there. We know it's open. But it actually, for me, turned into a pretty cool, pretty nice event, a nice chance to sort of sum up what a big and unique project this is.
Yeah.
And unique, I'd almost forgotten it's unique in the way it was built and the way it was designed. They'd never done one this way before in terms of soliciting community input.
Yeah, it was written up in like national architecture and construction magazines, right?
Yeah.
What's it like under the bridge? I haven't had a chance to go to that observation tower where it took place. And I remember when I went to see Sue Minter when she was transportation secretary and really kind of playing up all this whole sort of, way they're kind of orienting it to the river and giving these sort of tourist opportunities to it. Is it cool?
Well, the backdrop was kind of cool because behind the speakers, you had the underside of the bridge, which is painted sort of like a sky blue.
Right.
And the sunlight was reflecting off the river, and so you had this sort of ripple effect on the bottom of the bridge.
Oh, wow.
And we were on this observation platform that's got all these sort of tree themes, white pine and beech and maple, and even the railing on the platform has leaves built into it. And you did get an appreciation for all the extra stuff that went into this bridge that frankly didn't have to be there from a design standpoint.
Yeah. Noisy? I mean,
Well,
I can't imagine they do anything to mitigate the noise from the traffic flying overhead at 70 miles an hour.
it's not as noisy as you'd think.
No,
Yeah.
I think wasn't that one of the design features they put in is the bridge itself is actually hollow and it's made to dampen some of that noise from the traffic.
Yeah, I mean, you're getting noise too from Route 30 across the river, but it was not as noisy as I've, I think we've all walked under highway overpasses, and this wasn't the same thing at all.
Yeah, so they did take that into consideration, and it shows because they want people to stop at this bridge. Now, the other aspect to it, and I haven't had a chance to go driving down there in a while, but can you pull off to the side of the road? Is there parking so people can actually use this observation area?
Well, I believe there's going to be a pull-off area
I mean, there's a bike lane.
On the Route
Right.
30 side of it. I
Right.
mean, why have a deck there if you can't access
Right.
it, right? But on the West River Trail side, you'd be able to access
Of course.
the deck, from the trail. Yeah.
Right. But from the Route 30 side, I mean, even if you park down at West River Park, that's still a bit of a hike
It
over
is.
to the deck.
Yeah, there's still, and I only know this because I drive past it to get home, but they're still kind of tinkering on the Route 30 side.
They are there, and that's one of the last areas that they're still working on the deck over there and things like that. One of the things I found out the other day that I maybe was already common knowledge, but they've permanently reduced the speed limit in that section of Route 30 down to 40 miles an
Oh,
hour.
they have finally. Okay, because I was
Yeah.
gonna say that's the other thing they need to tinker with is the speed limit.
Yeah.
And okay, that's
Yeah.
done. Good.
Yeah.
Good.
And
Because
it's not going back up in that section of Route 30.
no,
It's
it
gonna stay
shouldn't.
at 40.
Once they put in that West River Park and all the people pulling in and out of there, it had to be 40 miles an hour.
and I think the town announced that March, April, May, somewhere
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah.
And I guess it was quite a procedural thing because they had to go through VTrans and they had to go through all these state levels before, because it's a state road
Yeah.
in that section.
Yeah, but they got it done, and it's a mother of a beautiful bridge that is out there. I was quoting Kelly's Heroes there for people who know that movie. Anyway, Mike Fair, it's always been great to have you here on the show covering the news for us. It's really appreciate all the work that you do for our community and covering everything. I'm looking forward to seeing you out in the community. I'm sorry this is our last time on the radio, but appreciate all the times you've been on the air with me. Thanks so much.
It's been great to be here, Chris.
All right. Thanks a lot. And you can read his writing on vtdigger.org, commonsnews.org, and reformer.com. You can also follow him on Twitter. He loves Twitter followers, at Mike Fair. Back to wrap up this edition of Green Mountain Mornings right after these messages.